Join our family of creators. Your support means the world to us. Subscribe now to the Content Creator channel. Your support keeps us motivated and helps us bring you fresh, exciting content every week. Hit that subscribe button and be part of our journey. The relationship between Canada and the United States has long been described as more than just an alliance. It is a family affair, shared border-intertwined economies, generations of mutual respect. Yet, recent years have tested this bond in ways previously unimaginable. A stunning new poll released in late 2024 reveals a stark and troubling reality. Canadian trust in American leadership has plummeted to historic lows, a direct consequence of the turbulent presidency of Donald Trump. This isn't merely a fleeting dip in public opinion, but a fundamental reassessment of a partnership once taken for granted. The data suggests a deep-seated skepticism has taken root north of the 49th parallel, raising profound questions about the future of this continental relationship. This crisis of confidence did not emerge overnight. It was the culmination of 4 years of unpredictable policy decisions, aggressive rhetoric, a perceived disregard for long-standing international norms. For many Canadians, the United States under President Trump began to look less like a reliable neighbor and more like a volatile and self-interested power. The predictable, steady hand that had guided American foreign policy for decades was replaced by a leadership style that seemed to thrive on disruption. This shift sent shockwaves through a country that has always anchored its own foreign and economic policy to the stability of its southern neighbor, forcing a national conversation about Canada's place in a changing world. The story of Canada's declining trust in U.S. leadership is most powerfully told through the cold, hard data polls conducted by respected firms Pew Research Center and Gallup paint an astonishingly clear picture, a relationship in freefall. Before his term began, Canadian confidence in the U.S. president hovered at high levels, often exceeding 80% during the Obama administration. This reflected a general sense of stability and shared purpose. Within the first year of the Trump presidency, that figure plummeted dramatically, in some polls dropping below 25%. This was not a gradual erosion, it was a cliff. This drop was not an anomaly, but the start of a sustained trend year after year. As the Trump administration pursued its America First agenda, confidence stayed stubbornly low. A landmark 2020 Pew survey found just 20% confidence in Trump, the lowest in nearly 2 decades of the survey. Leaders from more distant countries often polled higher. The disbelief was widespread across different age groups, political affiliations, and regions of the country, British Columbia to Newfoundland. Comparing to historical data underscores the magnitude of the shift. Few events crystallized the deterioration of Canadian-American relations under Donald Trump more than the tumultuous renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. For over 2 decades, NAFTA had been the cornerstone of the continent's economic architecture and integration. President Trump called it the worst trade deal ever and threatened to tear it up entirely. That stance sent a shockwave through the Canadian economy, which relies on the U.S. for over 75% of its exports. The threat felt like an attack on continental cooperation. A damaging moment came when the U.S. imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, citing national security. For Canadians, this justification was baffling and offensive. The idea that Canada, a long-standing NORAD ally, could be a security threat was seen as absurd and insulting. The dispute threatened jobs in the Canadian steel sector and the auto sector. It changed how many Canadians viewed their southern neighbor. Perception grew that the U.S. was an unpredictable bully willing to sacrifice close friendships for political gain. Ultimately, a new deal was signed, but the scars remain, but at a cost to goodwill and trust. Beyond the tangible policy disputes over trade and tariffs, it was the rhetoric of the Trump administration that did profound and lasting damage to Canadian trust. Words matter in diplomacy, and the language emanating from the White House during those 4 years was often seen as dismissive, aggressive, openly hostile toward traditional allies, including Canada. The America First slogan, while intended for a domestic audience, was interpreted abroad as America alone for Canadians, who have long prided themselves on a multilateral approach to global challenges. This inward turn was deeply unsettling. It signaled a U.S. that was abdicating its role as a global leader in favor of a narrow, transactional nationalism. President Trump's frequent and unfiltered use of social media became a constant source of anxiety and confusion for Canadian officials and the public alike. Major policy announcements, personal attacks on allied leaders' threats of economic consequences were often delivered in early morning tweets bypassing traditional diplomatic channels entirely. A particularly low point for many Canadians was after the 2018 G7 summit in Charlevoix, Quebec, when President Trump tweeted that Prime Minister Trudeau was very dishonest and weak simply for reiterating Canada's long-standing position on trade. This verbal assault was not an isolated incident. The decline in Canadian trust wasn't just about bilateral fights, it was driven by the Trump administration's disruptive global approach. Canadians watched with growing alarm as the U.S. withdrew from key international agreements and institutions, the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement on climate change. For a Canadian government that put climate action at the center of its agenda, this looked like an abdication of global leadership, the U.S. exit from the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA open hostility toward the World Health Organization, open hostility toward the World Trade Organization. Together, these moves signaled a retreat from multilateralism. Canada, as a middle power, depends on a stable, rules-based order. The Trump administration's actions were seen as an assault on that order, making the world more chaotic and unpredictable. The result? The world felt more dangerous and Canada felt more isolated. These tensions had painful local consequences: the detention of Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver, China's retaliatory arrest of Michael Kovrig, China's retaliatory arrest of Michael Spavor. Many Canadians felt abandoned by the U.S., which appeared to treat the detainees as bargaining chips in a trade war. The erosion of trust in American leadership, not confined to newspapers or Parliament, it had tangible impacts on ordinary Canadians. One of the most immediate effects was seen in travel and tourism. Anecdotal and survey data showed a growing reluctance to visit the United States. The phenomenon was dubbed the Trump slump. Drivers included unease with the political climate, concerns about unpredictable border experiences, and a simple desire not to spend tourist dollars in a country whose leadership they opposed. This was a notable departure from the traditionally fluid movement across the border. The business community also felt the chill. Large corporations had resources to navigate uncertainty, but small and medium-sized enterprises that depend on cross-border trade did not. Constant threats of tariffs and unpredictable trade policy made long-term planning difficult for many businesses. For example, a business owner in Windsor supplying parts to the Detroit auto sector could no longer operate with the same certainty as before. Some were forced to explore new markets while others re-evaluated reliance on American suppliers and customers. This shift in trust also showed up in cultural and social attitudes. Casual admiration for American political and social institutions declined. Conversations at dinner tables and in coffee shops often turned to bewildering political drama south of the border. Political analysts and foreign policy experts on both sides of the border have extensively dissected the unprecedented collapse of Canadian trust. A consensus view among many Canadian scholars is that the Trump presidency exposed a fundamental vulnerability in Canada's foreign policy: its over-reliance on the assumption of a rational and predictable American partner. Dr. Melissa Hausman, a political science professor at Carleton University, argued in a 2023 paper that the period forced a painful but necessary reckoning in Ottawa. Policymakers could no longer operate on autopilot, assuming American and Canadian interests would naturally align. Every aspect of the relationship had to be re-evaluated through a new lens of potential volatility and self-interest. Journalists who covered the relationship daily provided a ground-level view of the disconnect. Susan Delacourt, a veteran political columnist, noted the core issue was a clash of political cultures. The Trump administration's transactional zero-sum approach to diplomacy was fundamentally alien to the Canadian preference for consensus-building multilateral solutions. It wasn't just about disagreeing on policy, it was about speaking two different political languages. This communication breakdown meant that even when interests might have aligned, the path to cooperation was blocked by a chasm of mutual misunderstanding. With Donald Trump's presidency now in the rearview mirror, a new chapter in Canada-US relations has begun, but the echo of the previous 4 years continues to reverberate. The change in administration in 2021 was met in Canada with a collective sigh of relief and a cautious sense of optimism. The return to a more conventional, predictable style of diplomacy from Washington was broadly welcomed. Leaders began meeting again with the traditional language of partnership and shared values. Cooperation was restored on key files like climate change, global health. On the surface, it appeared that the relationship was quickly getting back to normal after a period of intense strain. However, beneath this surface-level normalization, a deep-seated wariness persists. The polling data from 2024 and 2025 confirms this. While trust in American leadership has rebounded from its historic lows, it remains significantly below the levels seen during the Obama era. Many Canadians now view the American political landscape with a sense of apprehension. The fear that a future administration could once again upend treaties, impose tariffs, abandon allies with little warning has become a permanent part of the Canadian strategic calculus. The trust once shattered has been replaced by caution. The Canadian government continues to publicly champion its trade diversification strategy, actively pursuing and strengthening partnerships with the European Union nations in the Indo-Pacific region. This is no longer just an economic goal, it is a national security imperative, a direct lesson learned from the NAFTA renegotiation saga. The goal is to build a more resilient Canadian economy that is less susceptible to shocks from any single partner. No matter how close, this strategic shift represents one of the most enduring legacies of the Trump era on Canadian policy. Looking ahead, the relationship is best described as one of cautious re-engagement. Canada will always be bound to the United States by geography, a deeply intertwined economy. But the nature of the partnership has fundamentally changed. The era of unquestioning trust and taking the relationship for granted is over. Canadian leaders and the public are now more attuned to the political currents in the U.S. and more prepared for potential disruption. The hope is that the shared interests, deep people-to-people ties will ultimately prove stronger than the political divisions. But the memory of how quickly things can change serves as a constant and sobering reminder of the fragility of even the closest of friendships. Ultimately, most experts agree that the loss of trust was about more than just one person. It was about the realization that the American political system could produce a leader so willing to disregard the norms of international relations and alliances. As a result, Canadian experts like Roland Paris, a former foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Trudeau, have stressed the need for Canada to build firewalls to protect itself from future American political volatility. The lesson learned was that Canada must actively cultivate a more independent foreign policy. The story of Canada's lost trust in American leadership during the Trump years is more than just a footnote in diplomatic history. It is a critical chapter that redefines the future of this vital alliance. The damage inflicted was not merely cosmetic, it struck at the very core of the relationship. The belief in shared values, mutual respect, predictable partnership. As we move forward, the central question is not whether the relationship can function. It must out of necessity, but whether the deep, instinctual trust that once characterized it can ever be fully rebuilt. The answer to that will have profound consequences for the security and prosperity of both nations for decades to come. For the United States, understanding the Canadian perspective is crucial. The loss of trust from its most reliable and integrated ally should serve as a powerful warning. If America's closest friend grew so disillusioned, it signals a broader problem in how American leadership is perceived on the global stage. Rebuilding that trust requires more than just friendly rhetoric from a new administration, consistent, reliable, respectful action over many years. Ultimately, the Canada-US relationship is a bridge that connects two nations. For 4 years, that bridge was battered by political storms, and its foundations were shaken. While traffic is flowing again, structural weaknesses remain. Repairing it requires both countries to work together, patiently and deliberately, to reinforce the pillars of trust, respect, and shared interest.